From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Dr. Benefiel did graduate work in epigraphy at the University of Rome, and she holds a PhD in classical philology from Harvard University. Since 2005, she has taught at Washington and Lee University, where she is an associate professor of classics. Last year, she was awarded the State of Virginia's Outstanding Faculty Award, known as the Rising Star, which is given annually to 2 young faculty members selected from among all of Virginia's colleges and universities. Rebecca has an impressive list of grants and fellowships to her name that include not only the Kluge Fellowship, but also fellowships from the Archaeological Institute of America, the American Philosophical Society, and the American Academy of Rome. Her work has been included in numerous edited volumes, published by Routledge Press and others, with 2 Wiley-Blackwell publications on the near horizon. And her work also has been featured in both academic and popular press journals that stretch from the American Journal of Archaeology to the Smithsonian Magazine, Science News, and USA Today. Now, many of her colleagues may already have been aware of these accomplishments, but there is something that even her colleagues don't know about her. So listen up here, because Rebecca is also the ancient history consultant for the game show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Now, she cannot discuss any of the questions with you, but she can probably tell you a little bit about the experience. So please help me welcome her today, Dr. Rebecca Benefiel.
Thank you, Mary Lou, for that very kind introduction. And I do just want to say it's been such a privilege to have a fellowship here at the Library of Congress, to work in this beautiful, beautiful building, and to meet some fascinating colleagues and friends. So thank you all for being here. I will point out that the room that we're sitting in today is inspired by Pompeian wall painting. It definitely would not be decorated this way if Pompeii hadn't been rediscovered. I do have to also say a particular thank you to Victoria Ivanova, who was an intern here this spring and who helped me create some of the maps that you'll be seeing today. She is off on her first archaeological excavation herself in Bulgaria, so I wish her much luck. All right. The site of ancient Pompeii is famous for its wall painting. In fact, more than 90% of all the wall painting from the ancient world comes from this one site. Pompeii offers us an abundance of visual imagery, including ornately decorated scenes encompassing different planes and perspectives, as we see in this study in the house of Marcus Lucretius Fronto. Megalographic or large-scale compositions, like the famous room for which the Villa of the Mysteries was named. Mythological vignettes, like this depiction of Narcissus falling in love with his own image. And whimsical flourishes, such as this Cupid racing a chariot drawn by dolphins. These paintings have only survived to the present day because of the catastrophic destruction of Pompeii. In the year AD 79, the nearby volcano of Mount Vesuvius, which had been dormant for nearly 2,000 years, erupted and devastated the surrounding regions. The volcanic debris that rained down over the course of 2 days reached as far as Egypt, according to the writer Cassius Dio, and ended up burying the town of Pompeii to a depth of more than 10 meters. The city was effectively sealed off, and the friable wall plaster that covered virtually every surface was thereby preserved. What I am interested in is what else was on those walls. Take, for example, the House of the Four Styles. One enters the atrium, turns to the left, and finds there, atop the brightly colored second-style wall painting, a message incised or cut into the wall plaster. Written slightly below eye level, it reads, "Welcome to those whom LVP loves." So I've created an inversion because it's hard to make it out. So I've just changed it from the lettering being white to dark so that you can see it a little better. But quos LVP amat valeant. LVP are the initials of a Roman male. Roman females had only 2 names, so they'd only have 2 initials. This is not just a message of welcome, though. It's also an allusion to a popular poem, a poem that would have easily sprung to mind since it was so well known and copied throughout the town. That poem begins quis amat valeat in the singular. Whoever loves, may they be strong, or may they fare well. It continues, may he perish whoever does not know how to love, may he perish twice over whoever forbids love. It's also clear that deliberate care went into the writing of this message. These raised dots are interpuncts, a standard element of honorific inscriptions on stone, and here they appear between every word. The carefully spaced lettering also includes serifs, as well as the downward flourishes of the Q and the N at the beginning and end of the message, which thereby frame it. And this is one of several messages written on the walls in this house. So how do we make sense of this? The first thing we need to do is recognize that even though ancient wall inscriptions are called graffiti, they are very different from their modern counterparts. It's only by shedding our modern associations with the term that we can begin to understand what is happening in the 1st century AD. And in Pompeii of the 1st century, something is definitely happening. What this was is rather hard to get a sense of today. Pompeii still stands, but with every passing year, the wall painting becomes a little less vibrant, a few more walls fall down. The bare stones and bricks that make up most of the site today do not convey even a hint of what excavators found when they first uncovered the streets and buildings. A city full of writing. Building facades emerged like this, with scores upon scores of wall inscriptions, including everything from political campaign posters to greetings written to friends to individual prayers. But the variety that makes this material so fascinating is also partly what has made it so challenging to study. Indeed, despite this vast quantity of this archaeological material, it has been the subject of relatively few studies, and none at all that attempt to examine the phenomenon as a whole. This is a shame because Pompeii offers an incomparable look into a vast collection of non-literary writing. Egypt offers us the examples of messages Greco-Roman travelers left on famous sites, like the statue of Memnon. The fort town of Vindolanda in Britain, at the northern edge of the empire, has preserved letters on wax tablets. But no site in the ancient world offers as detailed and close-up a look into an entire city full of writing as does Pompeii. Today, I would like to approach the topic of ancient graffiti in 2 ways. First, I offer a broad introduction to this material and to the format and the wide-ranging content of these inscriptions. From this, I hope to give you a sense of the character and the nature of ancient graffiti. In the second part of my talk, I move from a close-up to a bird's-eye view, shifting away from discussion of individual graffiti to consideration of the phenomenon as a whole. So, to begin, we might start by simply asking, what are these inscriptions like, and what do they say? Pompeian wall inscriptions can be divided into 2 broad categories based on their form, those that were painted and those that were incised into the wall plaster. The painted inscriptions, also called dipinti, generally contain public information, the kind that might appear on billboards and posters today. The other category, graffiti, we'll return to in just a moment. Hundreds of painted inscriptions, for example, consist of campaign posters endorsing candidates for political office. Advertisements for gladiatorial games were painted as well. These inscriptions were painted in red or black, often high on the wall for better visibility, and they contain a more or less standard paleography. They also tend to employ formulaic abbreviations. So, for example, you see here highlighted in blue a compressed abbreviation for OVF. OVF was how you wrote, "I ask that you vote for." And so that abbreviation marks something as a campaign poster. So I ask that you vote for, if you look at the longest inscription there, we have, "I ask that you vote for Gaius Lollius Fuscus." He's running for aedile. There were two positions that were elected annually. Duovir, so you see that IIVIR on the top inscription. That was the chief executive officer, and there were two elected for a one-year term. And there were two aediles who were in charge of all public works, and they were elected annually as well, also for a one-year term. So in Pompeii, we have a lot of these campaign posters, as you can imagine, with these elections taking place annually. But you can see from these examples that abbreviations are a standard part of these campaign posters. So DR and DRP are the typical way that you say someone is worthy of serving in the government, worthy of office. Once you know a few of these abbreviations, it's really pretty easy to figure out almost any campaign poster. So you see, we've got, "I ask that you vote for Gnaeus Helvius Sabinus for aedile." He's worthy of serving in the government. VB is a very simple way to say that he's a vir bonus. He's a good man. And that's about as far as we go with these. So these are our campaign posters. The other category of wall inscriptions consists of those incised or scratched into the wall plaster. The term graffiti comes from the Italian word graffio, or scratch. It was originally applied to these writings because they're scratched into the surface. Only later was that term applied more generally to any writing on a wall as it is usually used today. These graffiti were written by individuals, in contrast to many of the painted inscriptions that were put up by teams of professionals. Graffiti could be created by anyone on the street with a sharp implement and a desire to write something. So here the content is all over the place. I've given you a couple of moments to look at this slide, and maybe if you're sitting close enough, you've been able to make out some of the letters on the bottom. We have H, I, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R. And in fact, what we have in this room, where renovations were clearly taking place, because you can see part of the wall is painted, and then part of it has this rough, plain plaster. In that rough, plain plaster that was put up when the door was inserted here, someone decided to write the entire Latin alphabet. But we get more than that. So we get greetings beautifully written like this one, from Pyrrhus, greetings to Alchemists. And you can see there are flourishes on this scratched in message as well. What's interesting when we see greetings in Pompeii is that people are not only identifying the person they're addressing, but they're also identifying themselves. So it's usually person A, named, sends greetings to person B. So anonymity is not a part of ancient wall inscriptions. Here we get a lovely message of "Long live the emperor." We don't know which emperor because Augustus here is the title emperor. It's not the name of what we think of as the first emperor of Rome. But Augusto Feliciter. This was, Feliciter was a phrase that's popular in Pompeii. It's good wishes to so-and-so, and you get it addressed to individuals and to groups. Then we get clusters of graffiti like this, where you can see the largest inscription up there is Epaphroditus was here with Thalia. Then a little bit lower, Quisquis is the beginning of something, whoever, ... And then what you can probably just get a glimpse of there at the bottom in much smaller letters, and these really all are small letters. They're about 3/10 of a centimeter high. It's really hard to write that small for us. Anyway, it's a 2-line poem. "How I wish I could be a gemstone for not more than an hour, so that I could give you pressed kisses as you sign your letters." A lot of graffiti have now crumbled, vanished, and are gone. But sometimes we still have a line drawing like this to give us a sense of at least what they did look like. And this also clues us into how difficult it was to figure out what day it was in the 1st century AD. Because what we have here are elements of the Roman calendar. And you can see we've got different columns. The first column, dies, day. That's a day, that's a column where we have Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. That's the week that we're all familiar with. But this 7-day week was actually pretty brand new in the middle of the 1st century AD. That second column, nundinae, is a list of all the towns in the region that would be holding a market day in rotation. And there are 8 towns mentioned there because up until the middle of the 1st century AD, the Roman calendrical system worked off an 8-day week. And then we have, at the far right, the days of the month. The Romans didn't count as we do successively. They counted backwards. So you can see, for example, 15, 14, 13, 12, 11 days, that many days until the calends, until the first of the following month. So it could very well have been difficult to figure out what day. If you say we're going to meet in 4 days' time, what day is that? So we have things like this. Since graffiti could be written by anyone, their content is extremely varied. They include everything from people such as this female slave who's offering prayers, to those cheering for their hometown, to insults using erotic language. Biggest is Maximus, so it could conceivably be the best, but I'll just leave it there as Maximus, to boast of gambling winnings and notices for a lost horse. People also left drawings like this labyrinth with the caption, Hic habitat Minotaurus. Here lives the Minotaur. Yet, interesting as these inscriptions may be, one only gets so far by analyzing the content of graffiti. And that's essentially what has happened in the field. The campaign posters offer more for analysis since they include the names of various candidates and the different government positions. Over the past 30 years, those inscriptions have powered 5 separate studies on local government and the rise and fall of the city's leading families. Significantly less has been done with these incised inscriptions. Only those with erotic content and those consisting of poetry have generated sustained scholarly interest. Certainly, there's much more that ancient graffiti can tell us, but only if we move beyond understanding and treating graffiti simply as text, and instead recognize their value as social and cultural artifacts. That means digging deeper than the typewritten page, the only place where most of these writings now exist. And it means heading to the field, where these graffiti were written and where they were seen. By whom were they created? What visual impact did they have? What relation did they have with their surroundings? These are questions that cannot be answered by the content of graffiti, but fortunately that's not all we have. Pompeii offers us an architectural and a social landscape, and by analyzing graffiti in relation to the ancient city, we may come to better understand both the city itself and the writings that were scattered through it. Let's take, for example, acclamations to the emperor. A group of painted inscriptions all contain a similar phrase, Judiciis Augusti feliciter, so hooray for the decisions of the emperor. 9 examples were collected and compared, and it was noted that 3 associated the emperor with a consort. So you have here, hooray for the decisions of the emperor and the empress, with you both safe and sound, we're happy forever. But as you can see, the emperor and empress are just being named by their titles, Augustus and Augusta. So it wasn't until this final example was discovered that the identity of the couple was determined. So the Empress Poppaea Augusta happens to have been the second wife of the Emperor Nero. Emilio Magaldi was the first to propose the now universal view that the decisions applauded here involved the emperor repealing a ban on gladiatorial games. This ban had been put in place as a result of a particularly violent riot that had broken out in the amphitheater of Pompeii in the year 59. This riot is discussed by the historian Tacitus in his Annales and is the subject of a large-scale fresco from a house in Pompeii. So in this fresco, you see the amphitheater of Pompeii, which is the main building there. And inside the amphitheater, there are people in the sand fighting, but you see also spilling outside of the building. There are people throwing things, attacking each other, falling on the ground. And so the riot seems to have taken over at least that corner of the city. Thus, this group of 9 wall inscriptions contributes to our knowledge of the history of Pompeii. But what if we look beyond the text and consider the location or the appearance of these inscriptions? All 9 were painted, not incised. This suggests that they were not spontaneous expressions. It wasn't simply that various Pompeians decided to thank the emperor in this way. Someone had to pay for the equipment and the workers to create them. Mapping out the locations tells us even more. These acclamations are not clustered in a particular area, such as that around the amphitheater. Instead, they're scattered across the width and length of the city. More than that, they're often placed at intersections where they might be visible to traffic coming from multiple directions. Altogether, it would seem difficult to traverse the city without coming across at least one of these acclamations. And this, I would suggest, may have been the point. If we examine only the text of the inscriptions, we find multiple variations and we can determine the identity of the ruler. If, however, we consider the physical format along with the heavily trafficked, conspicuous locations where they were posted, we have the repetition of a particular message and its systematic diffusion through town. This points to a programmed civic effort, one that was designed to fill the city with prominent displays to thank and honor the emperor. Historical accounts make clear that Nero passed through the Bay of Naples on his travels to Greece. Another graffito in town refers to a personal visit Nero made to Pompeii. Might these announcements have been posted specifically so that they would greet the emperor during his visit? And I actually wrote this up a couple of years ago, but it's funny coming back and looking at it in the year of the Queen's Jubilee. It made a bigger impact on me. In any case, this sort of approach takes us beyond considering which emperor intervened in civic affairs, and it prompts us to consider the matter from the perspective of the city's inhabitants, those who were responsible for creating these statements, and why and how they did so. So how can we ask those type of questions of the whole body of material? I propose that we widen our perspective so that instead of examining individual graffiti, we consider the collective whole. How prevalent were graffiti in this town? Or to put it another way, how often might a resident encounter this type of writing? In order to tackle this question, I offer a combined approach via 3 different perspectives. First, I begin by examining the corpus of graffiti and the city as a whole. I then move to the mid-range, scaling down to the city block to consider where graffiti appeared and where they did not. Finally, I analyze the individual building and explore graffiti within their archaeological context. The immediate stumbling block for assessing the overall phenomenon of ancient graffiti is that at present, we don't even know how many examples there are. This is a result of the fact that this material was collected and documented well before the age of computers. And although different epigraphic corpora have begun to be digitized over the past decade, the Pompeian material is on a vastly different scale, at least 5 times and as many as 30 times the size of other projects. My first step was therefore to tackle this deceptively simple question. The Pompeian wall inscriptions discovered through the 1950s are compiled in the Corpus of Latin Inscriptions, a large multi-volume project begun in the mid-19th century whose aim was to document all Latin inscriptions from the ancient world. So they cover North Africa, Britain, Syria, everything that was at one point a part of the Roman Empire. And CIL is divided up geographically. So volume 4 is dedicated to Pompeii and the region around Vesuvius. A page from it looks like this. The advantages of this work are there's one location where all the examples are cataloged, and each inscription is assigned its own number. So you see here we have 1474 to 1481, more or less. So that would seem to be helpful. The challenges of working with CIL, however, are that entries take forms such as this. So you see 1478, 1478A, 1481, 1481A. What's happening there is that they're collecting, documenting, and laying out all the inscriptions. Then someone goes back and finds another inscription. They have to be inserted. We don't have computers yet, and so they're inserted in different ways. Also, if you look at 1474, what we have is a graffito that gives the name Spiculus and gives the name Aptonatus. And below, in small cursive, you have noted that there's a depiction. This is how they talk about drawings of a gladiator standing and then a gladiator lying on the ground. Then you have typescript in the middle that tells you, just to the right of this, there's another gladiator, another pair of gladiators. And then 1474A tells you, here's some writing and here are drawings of horses. So you get kind of a lot of compression. And so even though we have these nice Arabic numerals, it doesn't give us a sense of how many we're actually working with. Another challenge is that CIL very happily does give us some information about where these graffiti were located, but it was keyed to an earlier plan of the city. So the graffiti in CIL are all referenced to this map from 1867 when excavations were going on and the houses were being numbered successively. What ends up happening is that Pompeii is just huge, and that system gets to be too unwieldy. So in the early 1900s, Giuseppe Fiorelli comes up with this idea of dividing the city into 9 regions. And each region is then divided into the individual city blocks, and then each city block is numbered with each doorway onto it. So any address or location in Pompeii is now given by this series of 3 numbers. All right, this winter I designed a database that is simple but flexible enough to allow for different types of analyses, especially queries into the geographic distribution and spatial analysis of graffiti. So, how many ancient graffiti are there in this medium-sized Roman town of about 150 acres? Nearby sites, we have Bosco Reale and Bosque Tre Case, together about 50 examples. We have one from Naples, 248 from nearby Herculaneum. We have villas just outside of Pompeii. Discoveries since 1956 account for another 200 examples. There are 815 drawings from Pompeii. And CIL gives us another 5,800 individual graffiti, which brings our total just in Pompeii, not counting the sites outside of it, to almost 7,000. To set this in perspective, this means in a town of 10,000 residents, we have 2 graffiti for every 3 men, women, and children. This makes clear that writing on the wall was not a limited activity. We're encountering a significant phenomenon. The real advantage of digitizing this corpus, however, is the fact that it allows us to conduct analyses on this material. So, for example, if we look at public versus private spaces, we see that only a minority of graffiti appear on building exteriors. Instead, at a rate of more than 2 to 1, graffiti occur inside buildings. And here I've excerpted open-air public buildings that don't really fall into one or the other. So where are graffiti found? Are there concentrations in certain areas of the city? Do they appear in some types of buildings but not others? Here, the city of Pompeii is too large to illustrate patterns that are intelligible, and so I've limited our search to the insula or city block. Here are the 3 examples that I've selected from different areas of the city. So to begin with, Region 9, Insula 3. It's a city block of mixed zone development. It's situated near the middle of the city and was bordered on one side by the Via Stabiana, the road that ran north-south through the length of town. Just north of this were the Central Baths, a new bath complex that was still under construction when the city was overwhelmed by Vesuvius. The color-coded Eschenbach plan illustrates that this insula contained a mix of workshops or industrial spaces, shown in purple, retail establishments or shops in yellow, A property involving hospitality in blue, this could be a brothel, an inn, or a place that served food. And finally, in beige, a couple of houses. 33 graffiti were found in this insula. They appear in 4 different buildings: a workshop at 932, a shop at 937, and 2 houses, 935 and 9325. Thus we find graffiti, here we go, in one of the many shops, in one of the 4 workshops, and in 2 of the 3 houses in this block. And if we look at the absolute numbers of graffiti, these houses deserve further attention, for almost 70% of all the graffiti here appear in them. It therefore seems prudent to look more closely at residential areas of the city. One place to turn is the northwestern section. Insula 15 in Regio 6 was excavated between 1895 and 1898 and is primarily residential, but as occurs throughout Pompeii, zoning is mixed. The very northernmost portion, in blue, is located just inside one of the city gates, and it offers services for visitors entering Pompeii: 2 thermopolia, which served hot food, and a large set of stables. There are only 2 industrial spaces in this insula, a small-scale workshop and a 2-room laundry establishment, and retail space is limited. The rest of the block consists of houses, including the well-known House of the Vetii, which occupies the southern portion of the insula. The overall number of graffiti in this block dwarfs our previous location. In contrast to the 33 examples in 9-3, this block features nearly 5 times as many, with a total of 140. The number of locations with graffiti also differs. In contrast to 4 buildings, here we find 11 different properties. This means nearly 3/4 of the buildings in this block featured inscribed messages. And if we map out which locations those are, in gray, it becomes remarkably clear that very little space was characterized as graffiti-free. In fact, when we look at this map, the question to ask might not be why do we find graffiti where we do, but rather why do we not find graffiti in those 4 locations? So what are these 4 locations? Well, we have this 2-room laundry establishment, and we have a 1-room shop, and as we've seen elsewhere, workshops and shops do not uniformly have graffiti in them. Then we have one of our thermopolia, which served hot food. The thermopolium just to the north of it did have graffiti. This one did not, but we can tell that it was undergoing renovations at the time of the eruption because there are large piles of building material, chalk and lime. So it seems that building was not in use. Finally, we have a large house about which not much is known. But this house at 61523 is the only house in the block that does not contain any graffiti. By contrast, the other 10 houses here all featured at least some messages written on their walls. The extent of writing in these homes varies from a minimum of 3 examples to a maximum of 14. The number in each residence does not correspond to the size of the house, nor is there a qualitative difference in the content of graffiti between houses of different sizes and levels of decoration. For example, the smallest house in the insula at 615-9 held a total of 9 graffiti, which included 2 poems and a quotation from Virgil's Aeneid. We might ask then, which was the more typical scenario? Are graffiti generally found in some buildings but not others, or are they found in the majority of buildings? Let's sample just one more area, the southern part of town, where Region 8, Insula 5 lies between the Forum and the Theater District. On the northern side of this block runs the Via dell'Abbondanza, the major road that stretches the length of town from the port out towards the amphitheater. Located along this major road and as close to the Forum as this block was, it must have been important real estate, a fact that's borne out by the amount of square footage given over towards retail along that road. So if you look at all of those yellow spaces. The interior portion was occupied by residential buildings and a large open area in green operated as a garden restaurant. And here in Insula 5 of Reggio 8, the same trends continue. Although no graffiti are recorded in the retail or industrial spaces of the insula, the other 7 properties, the large majority of this block, do feature writing. These are the garden restaurant and all 6 houses. What emerges from this analysis is that graffiti were regularly found within private residences. Not only were they found inside houses in Pompeii, they were found in the majority of houses. Indeed, it was far more common for a house to have writings on its walls than for it to be without. Discussions of Pompeian domestic space have generally mentioned graffiti sporadically. In certain cases, the existence of graffiti has been used to suggest that a property was abandoned. Analysis of even just a few blocks, as we've seen here, shows that this is to misunderstand the evidence. Ancient graffiti are not found in only a few dilapidated structures. They're found throughout the city, outside and within properties, especially homes. And so I'm panning out just a little bit to show you Region 7, which covers essentially central Pompeii on both sides of the Forum, to give you a sense that this really does happen city block after city block after city block. And in fact, there's only one insula here where there's a single location with graffiti, and there I wonder about the documentation that took place. But you can see it's pretty prevalent elsewhere. So it should also be underscored that the number of graffiti we have recorded is only a minimum and may be a portion of what was originally extant. With the fading of wall plaster, ancient graffiti can be difficult to detect, and multiple visits under different lighting conditions are necessary. It may be the case that some shops, for example, decorated as they were with simple, plain white plaster, did not attract the attention of excavators, but may have once held some writings on their walls. So we do see in some retail spaces that it seems the shopkeeper was keeping track of people's accounts with names and a series of Roman numerals. But it's not the sort of thing that really jumps off the wall at you. We cannot argue from silence or draw solid conclusions about the absence of wall inscriptions, but what we can say with certainty is that there were at least this many wall inscriptions in a particular building or a particular insula, and there may have been even more. Finally, let's explore the presence of graffiti within the Pompeian house. The house of Gnaeus Castricius serves as a prime example because it was excavated as recently as the 1960s, and a roof was installed over it, so almost all the graffiti discovered there are still intact and legible. Occupying more than 16,000 square feet and standing 4 stories tall, this residence ranks among the 20 largest houses in Pompeii. It also had one of the best locations in town, standing atop the walls at the western edge of the city, where residents would have enjoyed a fabulous view over the Bay of Naples. So the shoreline would have come up to the garden level there. You've got a garden, then you've got a second floor with a large private bath complex, double peristyles on the 3rd floor, and at least a 4th floor. This house also had 71 graffiti within it. In this house, as elsewhere, it becomes clear that there are 3 key characteristics of graffiti in domestic spaces. First, they're centrally located. Graffiti are not hidden in remote or out-of-the-way places, but appear in the core spaces of the home. They're at the center, not the periphery. The 3 most heavily inscribed spaces in this house are all locations where people would frequently be passing: the vestibule into the house, the central peristyle, and the stairway connecting the central peristyle with living space on the 4th floor. Not only are these central spaces, architecturally speaking, but these are spaces that are central to the social life of the residents. In particular, where we have these black circles. The largest concentration of graffiti occurs at the entrance to room 7, the most important room of the house, where visitors and clients would have been received. This suite of rooms 7 and 8 is marked as important, both through its architecture and decoration. It's aligned on axis with the entrance, and the low wall that surrounds the peristyle includes only one break, which serves to guide the gaze of the viewer directly here. The decoration included a complicated mosaic pattern on the floor and this fresco of a heavily bejeweled female figure holding a golden scepter, wearing a golden crown, and looking out into the peristyle. And she's wearing so much jewelry. She's got earrings, she's got necklaces that include pearl necklace, emerald necklace, gold necklace. She's wearing these beautiful purple flowing robes that it's thought that this may have been Pompeian Venus, who was the guardian deity of the town. The second characteristic of graffiti in domestic spaces is intertwined with the location in these, with these high prestige locations. And that is, ancient graffiti are almost uniformly discreet. So outside the entrance to room 7, there are 18 graffiti, but given this quantity, it's remarkable to see how unobtrusive they are. So the example we have here that I've shown you is there's a spiral form candelabra, and it's a very thin spiral form candelabra, and if you can see directly next to it, not across any figural imagery, but next to it we have these very tiny letters that say Romula wa, farewell, or bye, or take care, Romula. It's written in small letters, as are most of these, as are all of these graffiti, most of which are smaller than 1 centimeter tall. This small size produces an understated presence and allows the text to blend more or less into their surroundings. In fact, if you're standing more than 2.5 feet away, you can't see them at all. We can contrast these graffiti outside of room 7 with those in the vestibule, which you see here on the right-hand side. There, graffiti liberated by more ample space and the lack of decoration to be avoided are written in larger letters, averaging 3 centimeters in height. So they're much larger, but they're still very small. Thirdly, I am going to apply the adjective of respectful. There is a certain respect that's going on even when we have clusters of messages here. So graffiti are respectful of the existing wall decoration and of other messages. So in the stairwell, we have this panel that has yielded 11 separate graffiti, many of which have multiple lines, but you can see they're arranged more or less vertically into 2 columns, and none of them overlap each other. If you look at the second example in column 1, Suave Mare Magno, you can see these nice flourishes which are taking up all of the space between the 2 poems above and below it, but it's being fit into there very carefully. This particular clustering holds some of the most popular epigrams from Pompeii, but there's also a high level of originality. So we have a poem that begins, "We came here desiring," and here we don't have the second line that appears everywhere else through Pompeii, but we have a modification. That girl holds back our feet. And the other poem that we have here, "Whoever loves, may she fare well, quis amat valeat," is that poem that I mentioned at the beginning. Here, it's not standing on its own as it does in most other places in Pompeii, but it's being added as this concluding flourish to another poem, "Beautiful girl, you seek the kisses that I stole," which is not found anywhere else in town, but it is another elegiac couplet. So this wall in the house of Gnaeus Castricius provides one particularly literate example of graffiti inspiring and creating a conversation with each other. Let's then return to the House of the Four Styles, where we first began, and consider again that message of welcome. This graffito shares the characteristics of those found in the house of Gnaeus Castricius. It's in a central space, located in the largest and most visible space of the atrium. It's nevertheless discreet, measuring only 1.5 to 2 centimeters high. And, as do the other graffiti in this house, this one shows a certain level of respect It's not written across any of the colored panels, but it's contained within it. The serifs and the care that went into inscribing this message suggest that the intention of the writer was not to deface. Instead, we may understand it best by taking it at face value. A carefully created, poetically inspired message of welcome to those who enter. The presence of ancient graffiti, then, does not suggest that the House of the Four Styles was abandoned, or even out of the ordinary. Indeed, the writings on its walls puts this house in the same category with most others on the block and with most others in the town. So how often would a Pompeian encounter graffiti? Anytime he stepped outside, certainly. Writing inside houses is another matter. The small size and discreet nature of these messages suggests that one could pass through a house without noticing them. But for those individuals who could read and who knew where to look, there might be messages to entertain, challenge, or welcome the viewer. These different perspectives each contribute to a fuller understanding of the epigraphic landscape in Pompeii. Not only was official information posted, but significant numbers of the population took an interest in creating texts themselves. From the Pompeians who wanted to show off their talents at quoting or composing poetry, or those who wrote greetings to friends, to the businessmen who kept track of clients' accounts, to the city councilmen who wanted to make sure the place was ready for an important visit. People of all classes and motivations were responsible for creating text and contributing to the vast amount of writing in this ancient city. From the individual house to the city block to the streets throughout town, writing was everywhere. It was both consumed and produced by inhabitants, a part of their daily life and a part of the urban fabric of first century Pompeii. Thank you. Sorry, Mary Lou. Sure, I'm happy to. Yeah, happy to take questions. Hi, Peter. Yeah, that is the big question. And it's something that people have really shied away from, saying, well, there are these graffiti in Pompeii, but they're all short. They don't really say much. And that's why one of the main things I wanted to do was find out, what sort of numbers are we talking about here? When we have 7,000 individual writings, I think we can't ignore that this body of writing does suggest that more than a few people were literate in Pompeii, that they knew how to write their names. Absolutely. What I found so far is that this phenomenon seems to be an urban behavior. So even in the villas outside, you still have writing on the walls, but in the country villas, where you probably don't have the same sort of business transactions happening on a daily basis, where people coming and going, there you have graffiti that are more functional. You get a lot of numbers with people keeping track of things, and you get more drawings. In Pompeii, I think the urban context meant that larger numbers of people were using writing. And so we have writing on the walls. We also have a good amount of writing on merchandise. So the amphoras that carried oil and wine and fish sauce, those popular, are often labeled with either the contents or the name of the location where it's heading to. But the literacy question is a big one. And it's why I wanted to go about my research kind of systematically to lay out, this is where we find it. It's not just a sporadic occurrence. It's in all of these locations. As far as who is participating, I think it's really surprising because, as I said, people are identifying themselves. And so we have males and females, and certainly females to a lesser extent, but we've got hundreds of female names who are writing greetings to their friends, or like Methe, we have a female slave who's appealing to Pompeii and Venus. And it's a beautiful prayer that she's written. But we do have slaves, we have inhabitants of houses saying Romula. In fact, Romula lives here with her boyfriend. And we have visitors to the houses. So we have the bedroom attendant of the emperor who gives greetings to the most holy colony of Pompeii in one house. And I think that's all I'm going to say about literacy for right now. But thanks for the right question. Yes?
I was struck by the accent of subversive reference. When you studied praise of the emperor, were there no Pompeii or witch and down the emperor or anything like that?
There is one formal inscription where someone is identifying himself as a priest of Nero, and that particular phrase has been scratched out. And maybe it is interesting that these acclamations that I talked about, none of them name Nero specifically. But Nero is named elsewhere in about 50 other inscriptions. And if you think about the fact that he had fallen from grace and been killed more than 10 years earlier, those messages stayed up there. But yeah, the Pompeians were a pretty positive group. And I think maybe it's because there is this element of pride in being able to write, and so identify yourself that way. And if you're proud of this fact, then at this point they're communicating positively to the others in their community. Yes.
Question about the houses. Who's writing the inscriptions inside the Romula? Are they the owners or the guests? And if they can do that quietly or secretly, or just here grab a branch and carve on our walls there?
Yeah. Well, one of my questions at one point was, oh my gosh, how does everyone have something sharp to write with? Because sure, some people were writing in wax tablets, and you had a metal stylus that you could carve into the wax, which would be perfect for just writing on the plaster of the walls. But then someone pointed out to me, well, look, all the women are wearing these brooches that have, essentially safety pins in that, and that would be perfect to use as well. Who's doing this? Well, when I was trying to get my mind wrapped around the fact that these are showing up in houses, I was looking at the houses where there are the greatest number of graffiti, like the house of Gnaeus Castricius. And in those houses, most of them are the largest, most beautifully decorated houses. And they would have had domestic staff who would have been present. And if it was really a bad thing to write on the wall, I think they could have moved people along. But what's interesting is that kind of both in houses and perhaps more puzzlingly in public buildings, where people would have to be standing to put these messages up, where the messages are, they are in the most visible locations of the entire building. So if you're standing in the peristyle, anyone in any of the other rooms of the house can see you. And especially those important rooms that are on axis with the entrance, the doors to Roman houses would always be open. So anyone passing by could look in and see you doing that. So in terms of who's doing it, we do get people identifying themselves both as residents and as visitors. And Pompeian houses were also places where people did conduct business. They had clients coming to their house to meet with them. So I think it's really a mix. But what's interesting is that usually the inside the houses, the writing is so small that it suggests to me that it's people who are very comfortable with writing, who are doing it on a daily basis. The writing that's sometimes in the entranceways or outside of houses tends to be larger and less carefully managed. And I think that maybe shows people who are not as comfortable with writing but still wanted to participate, if that's okay. Yes?
Rebecca, you showed us the spatial extent of it all,
Yeah.
which as a geographer I thought was really great. But any sense of the temporal frames that we're talking here? Have you been able to see some sort of evolution by naming particular names?
Okay. Excellent question. So, do we have any temporal information? Happily, yes, but I have to nuance this. So the Basilica, which is the law courts, a major public building, which actually was a multifunctional space, but a very large building on the Forum, has a graffito that says, so-and-so was here on this date in the year when this person and this person were consuls, which is the year 80 BC. And that graffito has been taken as genuine and has been used to date that building. So I started off and I looked at the Basilica and found that we have four messages there that predate Augustus. And then under the Emperor Augustus, we have this kind of group of about 20 graffiti where people are writing back and forth to each other. And these slaves are playing a ball game. And then there's not much else that gives any indication that it would be earlier than, say, 50 AD. So the last 30 years, the last generation there. So at least in the Basilica, we have kind of a timeline. Most other places we don't have a timeline, but in certain sporadic locations, you'll get plaster peeling off the wall, and you can see that there are graffiti below as well. So in the house of Gnaeus Castricius, there's one room where the plaster has come off the wall, and what's interesting is below, there are graffiti in Greek. On the final surface of this house, everything's in Latin. But in general, it's been assumed that graffiti do belong to kind of the last generation of Pompeii. And some of the painted inscriptions, we have a few that have lasted from the early part of the century. But I would say about 75% probably date to the end. Yes. Yeah. I definitely think that what we have in this city is the blossoming of the epigraphic habit. And I think that really kind of what Augustus is doing with putting everything, monumentalizing everything, so calendars and lists of local magistrates. I think text starts to just be everywhere. Yeah, and then I think when you're walking down the street and are kind of being bombarded, I think that maybe that's what's helping it spill over into the domestic sphere as well. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
This is such fabulous information, and it seems like it could just grow exponentially.
Yeah.
If you had, a couple hundred years.
Yeah. Thanks.
But also, it's so interdisciplinary to fully build upon your work. What are you thinking of in the future? Are you thinking of opening up this information to crowdsourcing? Because you've got thousands of people out there with all of this data. Even more fabulous things can come from this.
Yeah. I am hoping. I'm hoping that by putting some of my work and my method out there, that people will recognize, wow, this is really fertile material, that we really can do something with it. And I'm hoping that will draw more people to work on Pompeii. But yes, definitely, that's the aim. That kind of, once I've processed all of the locations and all of CIL, it gives us, hopefully, decades of material to work with. So that's the hope. I'm glad that you got that sense. Thanks. That it's exciting stuff to work with.
Thanks, Rebecca, very much.
Thank you, Mary Lou.
I'm sure there's more questions that you could feel.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.